Welcome. Thank you for being with us today for our webinar. My name is Len Perna. I'm the founder and I'm the chairman of Turnkey Sports and Entertainment and Turnkey Search. We hope you're safe and sound wherever you are, and we really appreciate you being with us. Our industry has been hit hard. I'm hearing that the airline industry is down 97%. I think our industry, parts of our industry are down 100%. We've been hit super hard. The frontline workers in our industry are the HR professionals. The HR people are responsible for the people. And they had a hard job even before the pandemic. Now they're dealing with pay cuts, furloughs, layoffs, medical, hygiene, mental health, and all the uncertainty that goes with this pandemic. So our webinar today is really a shout out in honor of the HR professionals that are guiding all of our staff, all of our people through really challenging times. The title of our webinar is What to Do When Things Go Wrong. We actually stole that from our third speaker today, Frank Supovitz, who wrote a best-selling book. He's been in our industry for 40 years, did 9 Super Bowls. He wrote the book, What to Do When Things Go Wrong. And so we thought in honor of the HR professionals, we'd steal that title and have some great conversations around that topic today. So Frank will be up last. Without further ado, I'm really thrilled to bring up my partner, Rick Alessandri. Rick leads our media practice at Turnkey Search. Prior to Turnkey, he was 20 years at ESPN in various high-level roles, another 6 years at Univision. Rick, take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Len. Really appreciate the time today and appreciate all of you joining us for this timely seminar and webinar. I am incredibly thrilled to have my friend and former ESPN colleague, Ed Durso, join us today. Good to see you, Ed.
Rick, thank you. It's good to share a stage with you, even a virtual one on any occasion. Thank you.
Introduction on Ed. Ed's a semi-recent retiree. Spent almost 30 years at ESPN, including the last 21 as executive vice president, administration, where he oversaw activities such as legal, government affairs, communication, security, corporate outreach, and facilities, including the 120-acre plus Bristol headquarters. In addition, Ed served on the board of directors for ESPN for over 30 years. Prior to ESPN, Ed had spent 10 years in the office of the commissioner of Major League Baseball, where he ultimately served as executive vice president and chief operating officer under Commissioner Peter Uberoff. Ed's a graduate of Harvard University, where he studied economics, but more impressive to me was that he was Harvard's starting shortstop for 3 years, including back-to-back appearances in the College World Series. Thanks for joining us today, Ed. Also know that many of our former colleagues are joining us on this webinar and send their wishes to you.
Thank you. Nice to hear.
And in the days after 9/11, Michael Eisner and Bob Iger of the Walt Disney Company asked our boss at the time, George Bodenheimer, to establish a crisis management team to serve the needs of the Walt Disney Company's East Coast operations, excluding the parks. George then sought your counsel and advice in leading this effort to establish the team, which we ultimately branded the Northeast Crisis Management Team. In addition to 9/11, the team also focused on things such as Hurricane Sandy, blackouts, transit strikes, anthrax scares. As you think back to those days post 9/11, what were the guiding principles in establishing that crisis management team?
Well, sure. Thanks, Rick, for that introduction. I appreciate that. So the mission of the crisis management effort really was to better coordinate the crisis management planning and implementation, as you say, across the entire Walt Disney Company operations in the Northeast. And that was a territory that encompassed Bristol, ESPN in the north, all the way down to the Washington, D.C. News Bureau. Had some 5,000 employees who were located in dozens and dozens of different physical places. So there was an effort to kind of, get that group to work in a more concerted effort. 9/11 changed everything about thinking about how one manages, your business and focuses on safety and security. So 3 kind of guiding principles that we always look to and guided our work. the first and foremost was the safety of our people. They're your most valuable resource. It's the most important thing. You want to make sure they're cared for and well. Second thing we focused on was care for our property, our physical structures. Can we maintain them? What is their operational capability? And the third really was business continuity, worrying about the business. But people were always first, and that was the guiding principle of how we operated.
Can you briefly explain kind of the organizational structure of the crisis management team and how it was intended to work, given the disparate assets that the Walt Disney Company had in the Northeast region?
Sure. It was not a particularly easy task, since people were used to independently operating, but in this one area we were trying to put together a structure which would allow us to operate more effectively, so each part knew what the other part was doing. There's nothing magical about this. Generally speaking, these are established in a hierarchy by any enterprise or business that wants to undertake it. They're really in three different tiers. Tier one is the top group, which is your policy tier, the people who are charged with making decisions. This is the senior management group, the folks that have ultimate authority. But the important part for us, obviously, was that we made sure that there were representatives of each of the major areas of operations of Disney, right? So you're talking about everything from, as I say, the News Bureau, ESPN, the Disney stores, the Broadway theaters. So we had to figure out a way to get everybody in the room, be represented, and understand what it is we were trying to do. So tier one is a policy tier, decision makers. Tier two is really your operational expertise. So these are your subject matter experts, your chiefs, whether it's legal, finance, security, news, facilities, etc. And then tier three were the subgroups underneath tier two who could actually implement anything you needed to have done. So I'll ticking off on one of the examples that you laid out. Let's say we had a reported bomb threat in Times Square in Manhattan, right, 10 blocks, 15 blocks away from our nearest facility. We have a little bit of time to react. What would we do? In an ideal circumstance, the tier one members would meet, whether we met in person, by phone, or whatever, as quickly as we could. We would try to assess the situation and then make any decision. Let's just say we hypothetically said we want to issue an order that people are shelter in place because it's more dangerous to go outside than it is to stay inside. We would make that decision. We would make sure that the tier two people understood that that was the decision and what we wanted to do, and they would implement that. Obviously, would trigger activity by the security people, by the facilities people, to ensure that you don't have folks potentially running out into the street into a serious circumstance. That's not to say that you can actually keep people in. We're not a police force, obviously, so you had to understand that. But that is in simple format, and you could how it operated, and you could see how in any different anthrax, hurricanes, snowstorms, blackouts, fires, you can see how you would engage in a similar process in making sure that's how you would implement and how it would work.
Got it. When you think back on the lessons learned from the days leading that team to today's challenges and organizations, specifically HR executives, what are those lessons learned that can be applied today?
Yeah, this is a very different circumstance, just to point out the obvious, which is the crisis management team was essentially structured to deal with the immediacy of something which potentially put, in the next hour, people's lives in jeopardy. And I'm not discounting this, but the pandemic here is really something which is, and the activity has been very much managed by government and police and other entities. The crisis management team might have met on this issue to see in the early stages what resources we might be able to bring to bear. But it points out the object of your question, which is, for the most part, it's become a human resources management issue. Are people going to be paid, jobs, those kinds of issues? But I still think you still do kind of the same thing. HR professional, you do what you do every day, which is you're focusing on your people. You're trying to make sure that they have timely information about what it is your business is trying to do, where the future may lie, which I should point out is always a big challenge, especially so in today's world where the technology allows for information to flow to large numbers of people instantaneously, and you want to try and stay as ahead of that curve as you can. The one lesson I sort of took away from the crisis management group in dealing with some of these issues that we did is understanding when a crisis, if you will, passes over to become more of an HR operation. Hurricane Sandy, that was a crisis in the moment. We had to kind of deal with it, the safety of our people, the integrity of our structures. What are we doing about the business? Are we closing? When are we opening? All those kinds of questions were swirling around, and you needed to answer those. But after 2 or 3 or 4 days, it really became way more than an HR issue. Okay, if people are staying home from work because they can't get in because of whatever circumstance, schools are closed, the kids, what is the company policy going to be around whether, are we paying them? Are we asking them to take vacation pay? There's lots of questions that transition to become HR type questions. So I think if you're an HR professional and you're dealing with a formal crisis management team in your company, in your enterprise, recognize where you need to, take control more or less and step up and say, okay, this is a moment now when the HR team is more readily involved now and we're looking for them for answers as opposed to a crisis management structure, which is more broadly focused.
Forward to today, obviously, thinking back, to 9/11, how did ABC News and ESPN, how did we work towards protecting those employees who were needed, on the ground, because given their 24/7 news operations at the end of the day?
Right. So we learned the lesson pretty quickly that while we were implementing things, that the news group had a completely different set of perspective on any of these things. While everybody else was leaving the city, they're all coming into the city. They're driving to the flooded neighborhoods. They're trying to get stories from people who are directly impacted. And so what you need to do is, if you're in a similar circumstance, is recognize that they just have a different job to do. That's what their calling is. And interestingly enough, the resources that they already had in place for their own operations were pretty significant. I mean, they already had hotel rooms reserved and extra vehicles and had brought in extra food. They had all kinds of things set up to say, if we need to stay in place here for a week while we're covering Hurricane Sandy or whatever might be going on, they had the resources and set really to do that. So we actually learned some lessons from the news people, but we recognized that they had a different job to do. And what the crisis management team tried to do was to help coordinate available resources wherever we can, and then let them do their thing. We were concerned about the safety of folks. We wanted to know what kind of systems the news people had put in place to track people. How would you extract somebody if there were a problem? But to be honest, I mean, they were dealing with dangerous circumstances in case a major fire, flooding, and especially in Sandy, they had these crews out where water all of a sudden was enveloping trucks, and they weren't quite sure how they were going to get out. But ESPN had a slightly different take. Obviously, we were the closest I think we ever got to a circumstance like that was about 2 weeks after I left the company. Of course, we had the earthquake in San Francisco, which occurred, just the day of a World Series. I'm sorry, when I left baseball, and that is ESPN was on the spot in there, and they did a great job of providing news coverage, which they were entirely capable of doing. But it wasn't like they ran in there. They were there and figured out a way to manage the resources in a way that let them report. They did what they needed to do, and as an enterprise that's involved in it needs to recognize and support that.
And finally, Ed, in your experiences, what are the overarching leadership lessons that can be learned from your experience, but also as crisis unfolds in front of you, how can you best help your organization? What role do you play?
Yeah, I think if you're engaged in these areas directly, or if you're, if you're in a facilities group or you're managing a security operation, you'll need to, it's clear today, you need to be as prepared as you possibly can be for almost any eventuality you can think of. We did tabletop exercises all the time that covered the types of things you mentioned, in addition to, active shooters, chemical spills at the front door of your campus, What do you do if electricity goes out for a lengthy period of time? You think about trying to communicate with your employees. The world today is slightly different than 20 years ago. But one of the things we struggled with was, how are we going to do this if we can't actually use our computers at the time, right? The phone, but no one has a landline anymore. So you need to be prepared, think through what you might do. The second lesson, I think, is you gather as much information as you possibly can, as quickly as you can, about whatever circumstance you're dealing with. And actually having a news organization is helpful in that regard. They have, many times they had sources, and we were calling up and saying, what do you know about this? While we're trying to work through it. And a lot of times they had information they were more than willing to share with it. The third thing, I think, is once you've gathered whatever information you can, you need to make decisions when decisions need to be made. So you need to act in a timely fashion, I think, especially today when the means of communications among your employees is so sophisticated and so enhanced that they'll be sending you notes saying, hey, I just heard that we're going to do this. Is this true? Recognizing that there are no secrets really that can, practically speaking, be kept within companies, in my opinion. So you have to try and be ahead of that as best you can. And then once you make decisions, then you need to communicate them as quickly and as clearly as you can, which is not as easy as it sounds. We had templates prepared, for different scenarios in which we could just fill in the blanks. So we had some language that we already were comfortable with, so we didn't have to create it on the spot. But I'll tell you, having someone who, worked for 30 years at ESPN, overseeing, or participating in communications, trying to communicate effectively to large groups of people so that they take away a similar meaning to whatever you're communicating about is a difficult thing, and you need to think about it. So if you can be prepared and slightly be ahead of that game, you'll do yourself a service in that regard.
Well, Ed, I really want to thank you for the time today. It was always, working with you during that time. I think George clearly, obviously, made the right decision. You were always the voice of reason. You were always calm, cool, and collected in any situation that I ever saw you in terms of, catastrophes unfolding right in front of us. And you were always the voice.
Thank you.
As well. So thank you for your insights today. I hope you get to Ireland at some point. I know
thank you.
Hope you manage to find your way there once this calms down a bit. But it was good seeing you, and hope to see you soon in person.
Very good. Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks to Ed Durso for his time today. I'd like to now bring on stage my colleague, our Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer, Diana Buccino.
Hey, Rick. It's good to see you. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who's joining us today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mary Wittenberg to our discussion today. Mary is the president of EF Pro Cycling Team that competes internationally on the UCI World Tour, and also served for nearly 20 years with the New York Roadrunners, the nonprofit that runs the New York City Marathon. Hey, Mary, how you doing? It's good to see you.
Great to see you, Diana. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for joining us. I want to kind of jump in right there. I want to start with your time at the New York Roadrunners. When September 11th happened, you were Chief Operating Officer, and then in 2012, you were serving as Chief Executive Officer of the New York Roadrunners. With the marathon going off in the early days of November, September 11th, you had maybe 6 weeks to adjust, and Hurricane Sandy, which brought such devastation to New York City Metro in general, maybe 6 days to adjust. Just kind of take us back to those times and how the organization dealt with it, how you dealt with it as a leader, and what it really felt like during those events.
In many ways, it seems like yesterday. So 9/11 is, as many people will recall, was this devastating day where the world just stopped and all eyes were on New York City and DC and Pennsylvania. And I remember waking up the next morning and going for a run past armed guards in Central Park and thinking, will life ever be the same again in New York City or in the United States? And what many people don't know is within 3 days, we had heard from the city quietly, the marathon will go on and you will be key to bringing the city back together. And so while listening to Ed, it was bringing back all these logistical challenges to the changes we had to make, because with the needs of the city to recover from 9/11 and take care of the families and those lost, we no longer had our place for our expo, where we had to host the 30,000 runners to pick up their numbers and the like. But all these logistical challenges, and for the first time, security around the marathon being sky high and contingency planning being significant. That was a massive part of those 6 weeks, but we had a very clear why. Our job was to unite the city again and bring people back on the streets for the first time. So it was all about honoring those lost. It was about supporting the families impacted by 9/11. It was about flipping the script. And instead of New Yorkers cheering for all the runners from around the world, 24,000 people, many from across the world, came to New York, and they cheered the first responders, and they were thanking New Yorkers for being so strong and fighting and showing that we wouldn't back down to terrorism. So that was the backdrop to the team that I led and I was responsible for facing Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Hurricane Sandy hit us on Sunday night and Monday before Marathon 2012. Similarly, devastating day. Large areas of the city went dark. Areas of the city were underwater. There were huge issues with communication, and it took a while for the news to reveal how devastating the impact had been. And in those early days, it was, again, our why was clear: what is best for the city of New York? But by Wednesday, the news was we were going on, and we're the marathon people. We know how to carry on. And this time the marathon was going to be on ESPN, a big telethon. And we were going to work with our partners, ABC and ESPN, to bring awareness to the stories of New Yorkers and what their needs were and how we were going to help. Except the city was not ready. It clearly was not possible to have the marathon at that time. And it took too long for all of us involved and to realize that, and for the city to realize that. And so the marathon became the center of controversy instead of source of pride for all New Yorkers. And in the end, it actually ended up being this beautiful day where the marathon delivered to the city what we needed most. And that was marathoners from around the world carrying pallets of water up 19 flights in Coney Island when there was no electricity and people couldn't use their elevators. And we were in Midland Beach and in Staten Island, and where cars couldn't yet drive in, and we were carrying food and seeing what we could do to help. But it took too long to realize that's what the city needed that year. And so there was a massive lesson to me in all that every crisis is different. There are lessons that are similar, but it's so important to step back and really pause. And what is different this time? And to get any information you can from outside of where you are. Every one of these is a little bit different. That year, communication was a real issue, and it was, some areas were not touched and were fine, and others were in such bad condition, and it was hard to get all that information. But every crisis is different, and in some ways, our 9/11 experience probably caused us to not pause as much as we should have in 2012.
I mean, I can imagine that, and that you went into full operational mode, which is what you guys do. And, to your point, to take the step back, as you look back at your mindset in those times, and how is that shaping sort of your philosophy today, and how you're attacking and strategizing and trying to run your organization today? What have you taken from that, or how has it helped you create that?
So in my world today at EF Pro Cycling, where I run our World Tour professional men's racing team, what's the same as we start with our why, right? And we're all about inspiring people, and we're about representing our teammates at EF and our partners, and just helping people get the best out of themselves, and helping the local communities where we ride. The Tour de France is spectacular for France, right? And these local communities, and it's going to be amazing when we get back to Italy and we go into small towns that don't get the kind of traffic that our races will bring. But we know the main question is, our why is to do that, but when? Right. And when is what this is all about now, right? And Second is vision. These are moments of opportunity too. And you, as leaders, while you're dealing with the intensity of the given moment, and this is a pretty long burn. This is not a 1 day or 1 week crisis. This is a many months and more crisis. And so really keeping that vision of long-term, I think in our sport, it's going to end up being a massive opportunity. Cycling stands to benefit from coming together and realizing how we can be stronger in the future as a professional sport. And also there are more people on bikes now and families on bikes, and how are we going to continue to encourage that? And it's a great way of commuting, and it's great. We know it's so important for all of us to be as healthy as we can be. So this is going to be a moment to get more people on bikes. So keeping the long-term vision of how are we going to create opportunity out of this is important. And then ultimately our how is everything. So, you know, Len said, we thank the HR professionals because they're responsible for people. We're all responsible for people all the way through. And so our how is first of all people. And this is a tough time. This is an existential threat on many businesses. You know, it's been hard. We've had to ask more of our people. We've had to make changes that we would never wanted to make. And we have to, all as leaders, manage through that to do our very best for all of their people, whether it's a moment that we have to make changes or supporting the people that remain. It all has to be with how do we take care of these people and have that be first and foremost. And then the next how is just step by step. This is like an athlete in a race. You have to be, it's just take it a day at a time. You can look ahead and know what's out there, but don't get overwhelmed by when is this going to end. So a how of staying in step-by-step approach.
I think you're exactly right. And Ed mentioned it, you know, before as well, is, you know, maybe hindsight is 2020, and we can look at 9/11 and look at Sandy and say that felt like a moment in time. It was a day or a few days. Aftermath was much thereafter. This feels never ending, right? And so to your point, in taking care of the people, it's such a time of great anxiety, not only professionally for our industry and many others, but also personally. So how have you approached that with your team? What does it look like? How are you as a leader, and that we can share with the leaders that are on this and the HR execs that are on this? How has your approach been to taking care of your people?
One, I promise this too will pass. It will pass, and we will look back on it. Two, as painful as it is now, there's personal pain and there's professional pain. We will learn and we will grow. The craziest thing, after we had to cancel 2012 at the marathon, I spent years sharing with every other race director in marathon running all of our lessons, because I didn't want them to make the mistakes I did. And then when I did a startup with Richard Branson, our first race in San Francisco was the weekend of the wine country fires. I was an expert at canceling marathons by then. Who would have thought in 2012 I would use it? So unfortunately, you'll probably use a lot of the learnings from this experience. So just try to realize some positives will come out of it in terms of your professional experience, and you'll grow as an individual. As again, we are being tested, and we will grow in this. And I keep reminding my team, we're at this interesting phase now. I'm seeing a lot of creativity, right? Like we realize this is a moment where we have to think differently. And we keep trying to throw the rule book out and encouraging everyone around us, whether it's an organizer of a major race we want to participate in, or one of our partners. Let's just think differently. And that's a really liberating element of this. And I think we're about to see immense creativity and adaptability out of a lot of people. And the final point I remind everybody is this is a moment of compassion, and it is incredible every day to sit back and watch how people pull together when we really need it. And that's incredibly motivating. And if you're having a dark moment, and we all do in these days, just look around, you'll see some pretty inspiring and compelling steps and moves people are making on behalf of others.
And that I guess brings me to my last question with it too. You know, you had told me a story I'd like you to maybe share with these folks if you are interested in doing so. But, you know, in both 9/11 and in Sandy, everything was on hyperspeed. You were nonstop. You and your team would just plow forward? How do we handle this? What does it look like? Take us back to your personal mindset in that, and when you were able to reflect on it, and as you've reflected on it again, as you go through something like this that is an enduring crisis, how have you sort of focused your own mindset?
You have to take care of yourself every day. I was telling Diana, I remember the marathon was supposed to be the first weekend in November, and I think it was all the way in January. One day I was running in Central Park, and all of a sudden I looked up and said, oh, it's so light out here. Of course, it had been light every day since November 1st, but I was in some deep, dark tunnel until we had this resolution plan of how we were going to take care of our marathoners who had missed the marathon. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I've been in this dark tunnel. What have I been like to live with? And what have I been? I mean, hopefully I did a good job with my team, but I stay mindful of this will pass. I hadn't been through a big crisis like that in that way. And no matter where you are in this moment, it will pass, and try to keep that light coming in and not get overwhelmed by it. And, I am inspired by our athletes today. I was thinking today, like a guy, Rigoberto Urán is one of our big Colombian stars. And right now he is training. He's also dancing. You can check him out on Instagram. He's got this great dancing, all this fun going on too. But he is training, and he's in the day. He can't be worrying about, will there be a Tour de France? Will I win the Tour de France? We don't know the results of what's going to come out of all this. Just be an athlete, put our best effort in. And that's often where our deepest satisfaction comes, when we actually have no idea how this is going to end up. Mm-hmm. But if we give it our best every day, we can be proud of that effort, and we may well achieve all that we hope. If our dreams can come true in getting through this and ultimately emerging stronger.
It's great advice. Mary, thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
And Len, would like to kick it back to you for our third speaker.
Diana, thanks. Mary, thanks so much. Really, really appreciate it. We've got a couple of poll questions. I think just 2 or 3 poll questions there in the upper right-hand corner. In particular, there's a question we'd really love to have your feedback, which is, when the shit hits the fan and things really go wrong, what's the most crucial leadership trait that a leader needs to have? So hit one poll question if you can. Frank, my good friend and partner, client, and every other way that we've worked together, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here. For those who don't know Frank Supovitz, 40 years in the business, 10 years at Radio City Music Hall, 13 years at the NHL, which is where we got to know each other. Another 10 years at the National Football League, where he ran 9 Super Bowls and a whole lot of other big events. And the last 7 years, Frank has founded and is the CEO of his own firm, Fast Traffic, which is an event production company, a consulting company, event management, working on things like the Indianapolis 500 pre-show spectacular. He was heavily involved in the Pier 17 rooftop, which is one of the finest and best new concert facilities in the world right now. So, Frank, welcome. Great to see you.
Great to be here, Len. Thanks for having me.
So we stole your book title because we called this, what to do when things go wrong. And that is a book that you wrote that has become a bestseller. I've read it twice through, and I recommend it for anybody that wants to understand what to do under pressure when the shit hits the fan. This is your manual right here. So thanks for writing this book, and thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for reading it. And I'll thank you again, since you read it twice.
So the book starts out by saying you have to kind of imagine it before you can plan it. I mean, how do you imagine a pandemic? Who could have imagined this?
Nobody. Well, let's say that 99% of us would never have imagined a pandemic. You can imagine a lot of things. And whenever we do contingency planning, there's always going to be specifics to your particular company, your particular project, your particular brand, your particular event, whatever that happens to be. But But problems don't follow patterns, but solutions really often do. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. Think about the things that are existential to your business. You should always have contingency plans for those. And they can be fit to things that may include a pandemic or a hurricane or, God forbid, another attack. So for example, what if we can't get to the venue? What if the venue is not usable? What do you do then? What happens if you have a contractor that can no longer do the work? Maybe they go belly up, maybe they go into bankruptcy, maybe they have their own problems, they have a job action or something like that. Maybe there's a lawsuit that precludes them from being able to do it. Who knows? What happens if you have an interruption in your cash flow, your revenue flow, those types of things? Well, guess what? All of those things are happening now. You have to deal with them because of the pandemic. So if you had thought broadly during your contingency planning and included those kinds of issues that you may have to solve in the heat of the moment, then you're much better positioned to be able to respond to those things when they happen.
I mean, the thing I really liked about the book is that there's sort of this common fallacy that one thing goes wrong and then you can address that one thing and you're all set. But in reality, when one thing goes wrong, many things go wrong all at the same time. So, and you've had that happen to you, what are you doing when so many things like now are going wrong at the same time?
Well, and yeah, it happens that way all the time. Mary experienced that with the marathon, and many of us have experienced that. There's a bit of crisis triage that you have to do. And it's very similar to the way that medical triage is done, which is you deal with the things that are the most existential, the most threatening. In my view, and I will bet you most people will agree, but perhaps not everybody does, is health and safety trumps everything. It's a non-negotiable. If what you're dealing with includes health and safety issues, you handle the health and safety issues first. No question about it. So, if you had a structural failure somewhere, the first thing you're going to do is keep people from going into dangerous places. Right now, we're dealing with a health and safety problem, and it really is superseding everything else. So, health and safety first. The next is kind of the brand risk things that you deal with, which is what kinds of issues are going to reflect on our company, our project, or the piece of work that we're doing, the game, the event, whatever it happens to be. Those brand risks are next, because you have to fix them in order to make sure that you maintain a good relationship with your customers, a great relationship with your fans, that your brand is still authentic, it still stands for something, it still represents values that are common to your customers and to humans. Those are really important. The project or product risk is next, the things that affect the specific thing you're doing. So you can be, the brand might be forgiven, but the project or the product that you're dealing with is the one that's under threat. And the one that is really interesting to me is how many of us think about how this is impacting ourselves. That's the last thing you worry about, your personal brand. What am I going to be doing on Monday for a living now that this has happened to me? Don't even think about that. If you solve the other three, you're going to be fine. And financial risk actually fits in all of those things. So, whether it's a health and safety risk, a brand risk, a product risk, there's a financial risk involved in all of those things too.
So there's a concrete example. I hate to bring it up, but one of the Super Bowls, there was a blackout. The lights go out, had never happened before. You're running the event. Take us through, how did you react to that? What were the things in real time at that moment that were going on, both in your head and then on your walkie-talkie and all across all the rest of it? And how many people, let's call it, whether they're employees or call it independent contractors or other people helping, are you trying to sort of navigate at that exact second?
You know, I've never thought about how many I had to navigate. I remember the first thing was, all right, how do we get the plug back in the wall? But the second thing that you had to deal with, which really wasn't, you know, you had to find out what the root cause of the problem was. If it was something that was dangerous, again, going back to health and safety, if it was dangerous, if it was a cyber attack, it was a terror attack, something like that, it was a architectural failure, you know, you might have to evacuate the Superdome. That's where the game was, but you don't want to do that until you know that that people are in danger. So the people who are in charge of safety, security, law enforcement, they were activated immediately to try to figure out what was going on. The how are we going to fix it was later. The first was, do we have a problem where people are in danger? We have to figure out whether to tell them to leave or to tell them to stay. And telling them to leave is an irreversible decision. So you really had to be really careful about that. We determined relatively quickly, I would say within 2 or 3 minutes, that it was not a cyber attack or a terror attack. It was indeed a system failure, an electrical system failure, and it could be handled. But what was really the most important thing for me when we first started to tackle the issue was, what do we tell people? There were 74,000 people at Superdome. It was really important to be able to say something. You don't want, and Ed talked about all the different platforms that people communicate with today. You don't want rumors on social media taking over the conversation and determining the course of what's going to happen next. So we did have a social media command post inside our control center where we could communicate with people. We started to do that. We started to look at what people were saying so that we could take in intelligence. We could also handle misinformation that was out there. We had the ability to tell people that we were handling the situation, that they should stay in place, that we would be getting back underway. And in order to do that, we had to use the public address system, which in stadiums in this country, at least, thank goodness, most of them, if not all of them, have a battery backup to the public address system for life safety purposes. So if you did have a power failure, there was still a way to communicate with people. Those were the most important things that we could do. What do we tell people? And then we can deal with fixing the problem.
I mean, and you did also have 100 million people watching live.
Yeah, there was
at
no
that
pressure.
moment. No pressure at all.
No pressure.
And so, you know, what's the difference between sort of reacting in the moment and really responding? The book talks about that differentiating between reacting and responding. What is the difference?
Well, and Mary touched on this just a little while ago. Reacting is something you do right away, and it's involuntary almost. You know, it's sort of hitting your knee, and your knee kicks out. What the first thing you think of, you have to be a little bit disciplined to take a second or two. Sometimes time is so critical. It's in such short supply. You want to be able to make a decision very, very quickly, be decisive, and act on it. Take a second or two. All right, the decision I'm about to make, what are the unintended consequences of that decision? Am I ready to be able to activate that decision? What kinds of things follow that? And that's the difference between reacting and responding. When you're responding, you're being a little bit more thoughtful. If you have days, hours, minutes to be able to do that, and you don't have to make a decision within seconds, you can even be a little bit more thoughtful and involve other people in the conversation to make sure that whatever decision you're going to make is the right one. I'll give you a really quick example because you brought up the blackout. We were able to restore power and get the lights back up in 24 minutes. We didn't get started right away because, you know, with 100 million people watching, as you suggested, there's real pressure to get going again. And we could have teed up the ball right away, but the reason we didn't was because we had the time to say, okay, what other things does electricity do in a building? What else does it power? Do we have the instant replay system rebooted? Do we, what happens if you don't have instant replay? You tee up the ball, there's another score there, and in that game there were a lot of them. Or there was a controversial play, the official goes under the hood, you don't have instant replay. Now what's the story? It's not about the blackout anymore, right? What happens if you don't have the coach to quarterback systems working? What other information systems are you going to need to reboot? Does broadcasting have everything they need? Turned out one of the coach to quarterback systems didn't work. We had the time to be able to fix it. So we spent another 10 minutes just going through the checklist of all, not a printed checklist. We literally went around the room in the control center saying, what systems do you have that you need to make sure are working? Score
And
clock.
is there to this day, after that, was that checklist put together in advance for future Super Bowls? I mean, based on what happened, you guys said, okay, let's have this sitting at the ready?
I'll admit we didn't. What we did do was take more action to ensure that if there was a power interruption, it would be brief. MetLife Stadium had the equipment, and we installed additional equipment to make sure that didn't happen again.
So, the mantra of communicate or die, I mean, sometimes if you're not forced to make a decision in seconds, you may be forced to communicate in seconds to get the word out on things even before a decision is made. So talk about communicate or die, even when maybe you don't know exactly what to communicate.
And if you don't know what to communicate, that's okay. Just say, we recognize the problem, we're working on the problem. If you don't say that, people may think you're asleep at the switch, that you're confused, that you're panicking, that you've got no idea what to do next. Just the notion of being able to talk, and this is in masses of people, we're talking tens of thousands. If you have the ability to talk to people and just say, we are undergoing a power interruption in this particular case. We are working on repairing the situation. Please, stand by for more information. Say something. Don't say nothing. That's probably the most important lesson there.
So Frank, you've been in the industry a long time. You're one of the true pioneers and leaders of live events, the live experience. And I think a lot of us are in this industry because we love the live experience of concerts and sports and things like that. So thinking about the pandemic, and once we're on the other side of the mountain on this thing, what does the world look like for live experiences after the pandemic?
Mary's right. We're going to get past it. And I'm really convinced of that. I think that there's a short-term and a long-term future. The short-term future is what we're going to be grappling with in weeks, months, maybe a year. The questions that people will ask themselves are going to be more focused on cleanliness of the environment. People are going to have to keep their venues much, much more clean, more visibly clean, not just, the disinfecting, but if you see a napkin on the floor, your mind goes to places it really shouldn't. So that's going to be a big focus. The question of how many fans and when we're going to get fans back and how far apart they have to be, and do they need masks? Do they not need masks? All of that is going to be a short-term. There's going to be a short-term future to that where we're not going to get a green light. We're going to get a yellow light. It's going to be a flashing yellow light. Right now it's a red light. We're going to come back in waves. Just like we did after 9/11, when we came back, and people will remember, you waited in line, to go through security. It might have been 3 hours before a game, right? That became, much more efficient, and we still go through security, but it's a much more efficient process. It's a less intrusive process. We may have temperature checks at the security gates, just like we have security checks, and it'll be something as seamless where you're going to walk through a magnetometer. There's going to be a thermal imaging component to that. the technology will catch up to that, I'm sure. The long term is going to look really similar to where we used to be. And I know that people are scratching their heads about that, but here's why I think that. In 1918, there was a Spanish flu epidemic. It was actually a pandemic, and 675,000 Americans died. People were going to people were staying home. They were wearing masks. There were mass gathering prohibitions around the country, and it took about 18 months to 2 years. And in 1921, Major League Baseball established a new attendance record after the bottom dropping out, which, by the way, after the pandemic, there was also a tanking of the stock market and the economy. So very, very similar to what we're doing now. And people back then may have questioned what the future was going to be like. 3 years from now, 4 years from now, as Mary said, we'll be looking back at it. We'll have learned how to better deal with these things, and we'll have earlier warnings, I think, and the ability to respond where right now we're inventing the solutions.
How about advice for, in particular, HR leaders, or really anybody that's leading a team of people? Just any closing thoughts or advice for people like that?
I always found the worst thing that you can say to somebody when they're panicking or anxious is don't panic and don't be anxious. You can't do that. There's no such thing as no big deal, right? You have to lead by example. You have to model behaviors. If you are calm and exude confidence, then the people you work with will be calmer and exude more confidence too. I would say listen and be responsive. We're such good talkers. We're not great listeners. Listen to what people are going through, and then validate the fact that they're going through those things, and then lead by example. Be the person you want that person to be.
Frank, thank you so much for joining us, and everybody who's tuned in today. Really appreciate you being with us during such a crazy time. Stay safe, be healthy, and we'll catch you on the next one in a couple of weeks.
To you and everybody watching as well.
Thanks again. Take care now.
Bye-bye.